My name is Joel Tremblay. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a carpenter out of Riverton, a small town in the Ottawa Valley that most people drive through without stopping. We've got a hardware store, a Legion Hall, a hockey rink that smells like cold rubber and old wood, and a Tim Hortons that's been there longer than half the people in town. The roads are mostly two-lane, running past maple stands and woodlots and old farmhouses with rusted mailboxes at the end of long gravel drives. I run a small crew, just me and two part-timers, doing custom cabinetry, trim work, renovations, whatever people around here need. It's not glamorous. I get up early, work until my hands ache, and fall asleep nights before 10. My dad died when I was 26. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. He was 58 and had been planning to retire that fall. After the funeral, after everyone went home, and the casseroles stopped coming, the house I'd grown up in became something I didn't know how to be in anymore. I moved into a rental on Spruce Street, a duplex, nothing much, thin walls and a drafty mudroom. And I told myself it was temporary. That was 6 years ago. The Arsenault family owns the property next door to my shop. Not next door like a meter of fencing between us, but close enough. René Arsenault runs a small sawmill on the edge of the property, been there 30 years, and his wife Paulette grows a garden in the back that produces more tomatoes and zucchini than any two families could eat. They've got one daughter. Her name is Isabelle. Isabelle Arsenault is 28. She teaches at Riverton Elementary, grade 3. She drives a 10-year-old Subaru with a dent in the rear bumper she's never gotten fixed because, as she once told me, the dent is a perfect reminder of why she doesn't parallel park downtown. She coaches the girls' floor hockey team on Friday evenings at the rec center and brings food to the parish hall dinner every third Tuesday of the month. She's the kind of person who remembers that you take your coffee black and then actually remembers it the next time, without making a big thing of it. I'd known Isabelle for years the way you know most people in a small town. You wave, you exchange a few words at the hardware store or across a fence line. You see her at the Legion Christmas dinner and say the usual things and mean them in a general, comfortable way. I'd eaten supper at her parents' table twice. Once when Renee needed help fixing a structural issue in the mill, once at a neighborhood gathering Paulette, organized after the ice storm took out power for 4 days. I thought of Isabelle as a good person. The kind of person everyone in Riverton thought well of. The kind of person you'd say, without much thought, that any man would be lucky to have in his life. I hadn't yet understood that I was one of those men, or that I had been for longer than I was willing to admit. It started the way most things do, with something ordinary. Late September. I was working on a Reno job for a couple on Elm Street, and I had leftover hardwood. Good stuff, maple, too much to waste. I stopped by Renee's mill to ask if he knew anyone who could use it. Renee wasn't in. Isabelle was there instead, sitting at the picnic table out back with a stack of papers she was marking, a thermos beside her, and a red pen in her hand. She was wearing a flannel shirt over a gray top, hair pulled back, a small frown of concentration on her face. She looked up. Joel, Isabelle, is your dad around? He's in town. He'll be back in an hour or so. She set down her pen. You could wait, or I can tell him you stopped by. I almost said I'd leave a message. Instead, I said, I'll wait if that's all right. She nodded toward the thermos. There's coffee. I brought too much. I sat across from her at the picnic table. She poured me a cup without asking how I took it. Black, which was right, and I noticed she knew that, and went back to marking. I drank the coffee and watched the maples at the edge of the property. They were already turning. Orange and red at the tips, gold underneath. The valley does autumn better than anywhere else I've been. We talked a little, about the weather, about Renee's mill, about how her grade 3 class that year was particularly energetic, by which she meant, I understood, difficult. She mentioned that a family on her street had lost their dog, and she'd spent 40 minutes helping the kids look for it. She said it with a kind of matter-of-fact warmth, not like she was telling me something impressive about herself, just like it was the natural thing to have done. Renee came back. I stayed longer than I needed to. Walking back to my truck, I turned around once, without meaning to, and she was already back at her marking, red pen moving, thermos at her elbow, and the maples behind her bright against the gray sky. That image stayed with me longer than it had any right to. By October, I started noticing small things I'd never noticed before. The sound of her car on the gravel in the mornings when she left for school. The light in the kitchen at the back of the Arsenault house when I was working late in the shop. The way she waved when she walked past with her floor hockey bag on Friday evenings. Small ordinary things that had always been there, and that I had, for reasons I couldn't name, started paying attention to. The Riverton Parish Fall Supper happens every second Saturday of October. It's a big deal for a small town. Not fancy, but it fills up fast. Long tables, beef stew, tourtière, fresh bread from whoever's been volunteered to bake that week, and pies that go fast enough that you have to arrive early if you want a slice of the maple sugar one. I went because Renee had asked if I was coming, and because I had no good reason not to. Isabel was there. She was helping set up when I arrived, carrying a stack of folding chairs, with the efficiency of someone who has done this particular job many times, and stopped thinking of it as volunteer work and started thinking of it as just what you do on Fall Supper Saturday. She wore a dark green sweater I'd seen before, her hair down, and she was laughing at something Paulette had just said. I found a seat at a table with some of the older men from the Legion. I had stew and bread and kept telling myself I was having a fine time. My eyes kept finding Isabel across the hall. Pierre Morneau asked her to dance after supper. Pierre's a decent enough guy, a few years younger than me, works at the credit union. I watched her laugh and say something to him, and then he led her out toward the space that had been cleared by the stage. I kept talking to the men at my table and pretending I wasn't watching. After a while, Cécile Dupont came and stood beside me. Cécile is 71 and has lived in Riverton her whole life. She held a cup of tea and looked from me to the dance floor, unhurried. "Joel," she said. "Cécile." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been watching Isabelle Argenteau all evening. I've been talking to the guys from the Legion." She made a small sound. "You have been doing both, dear, and not giving equal attention." I didn't have a good answer for that. She patted my arm once, the way my grandmother used to, and moved on toward the dessert table. I stood there a little longer and eventually walked out into the parking lot and looked at the sky for a few minutes. The air was cold. The stars were clear the way they get in October when the humidity is gone. I asked myself honestly why it had bothered me to watch Isabel dance with someone else. Why I'd driven past her street twice last week on the way to jobs that didn't take me that direction. Why the memory of her at that picnic table? Flannel shirt, red pen, thermos, maple trees going gold, came back to me at odd moments with a kind of quiet weight. The answer came in a way that didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like finally reading something I'd been meaning to read for a while. I wanted to see Isabelle Arsenault every day. Not as the neighbor's daughter, not as someone I waved to at the hardware store, but as someone I could sit across a table from and drink bad coffee with in the morning and say ordinary things to and mean more than I was saying. I wanted the light in her kitchen window to be something I had a reason to look at. I drove home on the back road and thought about it the whole way. After that night, I started looking for reasons to be useful near the Arsenal property. Not obvious about it. I'm not built for obvious. I noticed the post on the south side of Renee's woodshed was rotting at the base. I mentioned it to Renee and offered to replace it on a Tuesday afternoon when I had a gap in my schedule. He accepted the way people in the valley accept help. Without much ceremony, with a handshake and the offer of a coffee after. Isabel was home that day. School was closed for a PD day. She came out mid-morning with 2 mugs and set one near where I was working. She didn't make a fuss about it. She sat on the back steps with the other mug and watched me work for a few minutes, and we talked about Renee's mill, about a heritage property she'd been following in the next county that was being threatened by development, about her grade 3 class putting on a small performance in December, and whether 32 8-year-olds singing carols was actually a good idea, or just ambitious. I worked more slowly than I needed to. Fernand Boudreau, old man who lived at the end of the gravel road past the sawmill, retired, widower, sharp as anyone I've known, called to me from his truck as he passed. He stopped and rolled down his window and looked from me to where Isabel was sitting on the steps. He drove on. 20 minutes later, when I was loading lumber back into my truck, Isabel came out again and handed me a wrapped piece of pie Paulette had sent over. She looked at me a second longer than usual. "You know," she said, "you've been around more than usual lately. Reen's post needed fixing." "It did." A small pause. "Is that the only reason?" She wasn't teasing. She was asking, and she was watching me the way a person watches when they actually want to know the answer. I said, "It might not be the only reason." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once, like I'd confirmed something she'd been quietly thinking about, and walked back inside. I stood in the driveway a long time before I started the truck. The following Tuesday, I found a reason to be back. There was a second post that needed reinforcing, genuinely. Not as an excuse, though I would have found one. And Renee had asked me to look at a door on the mill that wasn't hanging square. Isabel came out around noon wearing her school jacket, which meant she had an afternoon session. She was carrying a stack of permission forms and a tote bag and was clearly on her way out. She stopped when she saw me. You again. Post number 2. She smiled. It was a small one, the kind she kept mostly to herself. She stood beside the truck, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing particular. Then she had to go, and I watched her back the Subaru out of the drive with the careful attentiveness of someone who had taught herself to watch her distances ever since the parking incident. I was still smiling when I turned back to the post. That same afternoon, Fernand rolled past again. He stopped this time. Son, he said, out the window. Fernand, I'm going to say something and you can take it however you like. He looked at me with the calm, weathered directness of a man who has run out of patience for watching people dance around things. That girl's been patient a good long while. She's not going to wait forever, and she's the kind of person you don't find twice. I kept my hands on the post. I know it. He looked at me for a moment longer, then stopped knowing it quietly. He rolled up the window and drove on. I worked until 4, and then I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a while, looking at nothing in particular. My house on Spruce Street was quiet in the way it always was. Not a bad quiet, exactly, but an empty one. I'd gotten used to it the way you get used to a noise that's just always there. Except lately, without choosing to, I'd started noticing the absence of things. A second mug. Boots at the door that weren't mine. Someone to tell about the ridiculous thing that happened at the job site on Elm Street. I thought about what Fernand had said. I thought about Isabel on the back steps with her mug, watching me work. I thought about the way she'd asked, directly and without games, whether the post was really the only reason I kept coming around. I decided I was done knowing things quietly. The next time I saw her was a Saturday morning. I'd gone over to return some clamps I'd borrowed from Renee's shop. She was out front clearing the last of the dead plants from the flower border, down on one knee in the dirt, wearing garden gloves and a knitted hat her mother had probably made. She looked up when she heard my boots on the gravel. Morning, morning, these are Renee's. I held up the clamps. He's inside, I'll tell him. She pulled off a glove to take them. I didn't leave. I stood there a second, and then said what I'd been working up to for 3 weeks. Isabel, I want to ask you something. She looked at me. She didn't smile, didn't fill the silence. She just waited, and I understood that this was one of the things about her. She didn't perform patience. She just had it. I want to take you out properly. Not as neighbors. I'd like to drive you into town for dinner, if you'd be willing. A beat. I should have said it sooner. She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the glove in her hand, then back up at me. Her expression wasn't readable in any simple way. It was steady and careful and open, all at once. I've been wondering when you'd get there, she said. How long have you been wondering? She tilted her head. Since the fall supper. A pause. Maybe a little before? I let out a slow breath. So I was slow. She picked up her other glove from the ground. You were thorough, she said. That's a kinder word. I laughed, and the tension that had been sitting in my chest for 3 weeks came loose all at once. That Friday evening, I drove her into Pembroke for dinner. Nothing expensive. A place on the main street she'd mentioned once. A small Italian restaurant run by a family who'd been there since before either of us was born. We had pasta and bread and red wine, and we talked for 2.5 hours without noticing the time. She told me about her first year teaching, about how she'd cried in her car twice a week from October through December, and then one day stopped without knowing what had changed. I told her about my dad. Not all of it, just the part about the house going quiet and not knowing how to fill it. She didn't try to make it better. She just listened, and that was the right thing to do. On the drive back, the highway was dark and empty, the headlights picking up flashes of birch through the tree line. Isabel was looking out the passenger window, and I thought about how naturally she fit into the quiet. I asked her then, almost without thinking, "Are you happy here? In Riverton, teaching the way things are?" She thought before she answered. She always did. I think home is something you choose to see clearly, she said. A lot of people look at a small town and think, not enough. I look at it and think, this is mine. I know the people. I know which roads flood in spring. I know that the hardware store closes early on Tuesdays because Ron coaches minor hockey. She glanced over at me. Does that sound boring to you? It sounds exactly like what I think, I said. She smiled and went back to watching the highway. Good. Then you might be smarter than you look. I smiled the rest of the way home. After that, things moved in the unhurried way of two people who live close to each other and keep the same general pace. I came for dinner at the Arsenault house on Sunday evenings. Paulette set a place without mentioning it, the way people do when something has been agreed upon without being said out loud. Renee and I talked about wood prices and provincial politics and the state of the highway through the valley. Isabel sat across from me and said the occasional quiet, dry thing that made Paulette laugh. After dinner, we would walk down the gravel road to the end of the property and back, in the last of the evening light, and talk about whatever was on our minds. She told me about the heritage property she'd been following. An old stone farmhouse built in the 1880s, sitting on 40 acres, going to be sold to a developer unless someone stepped in. She'd been trying to find a preservation group that might be interested. I told her I'd looked at the property once, years ago, out of curiosity. She looked at me like I'd said something important. I wasn't sure I had, but she remembered. I started working on the house on Spruce Street, not dramatically, not all at once. I replaced the kitchen counters over a long November weekend because they'd been bothering my for 2 years, and I'd been putting it off. The way you put off things that only affect yourself. I fixed the back door so it didn't stick in damp weather. I put in a proper mudroom shelf with hooks, something I should have done the first winter. And then, without quite planning it, I started thinking about what the house might look like to someone else, what it would feel like. Whether there was enough light in the front room in the afternoons, whether the second bedroom, which I used for storage, could be something else. I didn't tell Isabel any of this. On a Saturday afternoon in December, Isabel stopped by to drop off a container of tourtière Paulette had made. Too much, as always, because Paulette cooked like she was expecting more people than ever actually arrived. She stepped inside for the first time since I'd made the changes. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around. I watched her face. "You fixed it," she said. "It needed doing." She walked to the window above the sink, a bigger one than before. I'd replaced it back in November when I was fixing the frame anyway. It looked out over the backyard and the stand of birch at the property line. Morning light, when it came, would come through there. "Did you make this window bigger?" she asked. The frame was rotting. Easier to go up a size than to match the old glass. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the birch. Then she looked back at me. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. "You knew what you were doing," she said quietly. I didn't argue with that. I thought about the light. She was quiet again. Then she set the tourtière on the counter, walked past me back toward the door, and paused with her hand on the frame. "Thank you," she said. She wasn't thanking me for a window, and I knew it. She was thanking me for thinking forward, for making room, for doing the quiet work in advance of anything being decided. For treating the house like it was already becoming something else. I'd done the same thing my father used to do. Not make announcements, just show up and do the work, and trust that the right person would understand. Winter in the Ottawa Valley is not easy. It's not scenic the way people from cities imagine it. All cozy cabin and fireside. It's a foot of snow on a Thursday, and your truck not starting and ice on the county road, and the furnace making a sound it didn't make last year. But there was Isabel in it with me. Sunday dinners and walks, and the occasional trip into Pembroke, and the morning I stopped at the school to drop off a small cabinet I'd built for her classroom. A storage thing she'd mentioned needing, nothing big. And she came out to the parking lot in her coat and stood by the truck for 15 minutes talking, so long that her colleague knocked on the window from inside with a pointed look, and Isabel laughed and said she had to go. I drove away grinning, like a man who had forgotten to act like he was used to things being good. I asked Isabel to marry me in February, on the gravel road at the edge of the Arsenault property. I had thought, briefly, about something more considered: Pembroke, a restaurant, a ring box wrapped properly. And then I thought about where everything real between us had happened: the picnic table with the thermos and the red pen, the back steps with the 2 mugs, the flower border where she'd been on one knee in the garden gloves, the gravel drive. Everything between us had happened on ordinary ground. The proposal belonged there too. It was a Sunday afternoon, cold enough to see your breath, the birch and spruce bare along the tree line. Isabel was beside me, coat buttoned, hands in her pockets, talking about the grade 3 carol performance and how Matthew Picard had sung his solo with such conviction that 2 parents in the front row had actually gotten emotional, which she found both surprising and deeply satisfying. I was listening, and also holding the ring in my coat pocket, and also trying to figure out when to stop walking. I stopped walking. She went 2 steps farther before she realized. She turned around. "Joel!" I took my hand out of my pocket. She looked at the ring. She looked at me. Her expression went through something I didn't know how to name. Surprise, then something quieter and steadier, like a thought confirming itself. I said what I meant, the same way I'd always tried to. Plainly. I know I was slow to get here. I know it took me longer to see clearly than it should have, but I see you clearly now. You're the most straightforwardly good person I know, and the most interesting, and you never let me get away with taking the easy answer. I want to build something with you, a home, a life, whatever that becomes. Isabel, will you marry me? She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, you know, when you finally stop being careful, you say the right things. I said, is that a yes? She said, it's been a yes for a while. I put the ring on her finger. My grandmother's ring, silver, a small blue stone the color of Lake Doré in summer, and she looked down at it in the particular way people look at something they already know they'll keep. Then she looked up and kissed me, right there on the gravel road, with the birch trees bare against the winter sky. Paulette cried when we went inside, not sad tears. The kind that means something you have been hoping for has finally happened exactly as you hoped. Renee shook my hand with both of his, which is how men in this part of the world say everything they don't normally put into words, and then turned away to look at something in the yard for a moment. That night, Cécile Dupont called to say she'd heard the news. How she'd heard already, I have no idea. Riverton is not a large town. Joel Tremblay, she said. Cécile, good, she said, just that. Then she hung up. Fernand stopped me in the parking lot of the hardware store the next morning. He looked at my hand, realized a ring wouldn't be there, and then looked at my face, which apparently told him what he needed to know. About time, he said. So I've been told. He made a satisfied sound and got into his truck. We were married on a Saturday in June, at the parish hall where the fall supper happens every year. We didn't want anything complicated. Long tables, neighbors, food from Paulette's kitchen, and contributions from half the town. Renee stood beside me at the front of the hall, looking like a man who had been told he had to stand still and was putting real effort into it. When Isabel came in with her mother, a simple dress, ivory, nothing elaborate, exactly right for her. I thought about the picnic table in September, and the coffee she'd poured without asking how I took it, and how I'd stayed longer than I needed to, and how that was, without knowing it at the time, the beginning of everything. Father Lacroix kept the ceremony to what it needed to be. No speeches. Isabel's vows were clear and a little surprising. She said she appreciated my steadiness more than I knew, and that she had decided a long time ago that she'd rather wait for someone honest and slow than settle for someone fast and hollow. I felt something in that land. My vows were shorter. I told her I would see her every day. Not only when things were easy, but when they weren't, and that I'd spent enough years living quietly in a house that echoed to know that the right person changes the sound of a whole life. Then we were married. That June evening, after the dancing and the tourtière and 3 different kinds of pie, after Fernand had played his old fiddle for an hour and a half, and Cécile had danced with what I can only describe as alarming enthusiasm, Isabel and I drove home to Spruce Street. She walked through the door of the house that was now our house, hung her coat on the hook I'd installed in the mudroom, and stood in the kitchen with her shoes off, the way you stand somewhere when you intend to stay. She looked around, out the window over the sink, through to the front room where the light came in properly in the afternoons now. This is a good house, she said. It is now, I said. She smiled at that and didn't argue. The years after that were real years, not the simple version. We had cold winters and expensive repairs, and the summer the well pump went out and needed replacing. We disagreed about things, and we learned to work those through. Isabel kept teaching, kept her grade 3s in line, kept going to the parish hall dinner. I took on a bigger reno contract in the 3rd year and hired a full-time second carpenter. She did the books for the business because she was better at it, and we both had the sense to admit that early. The Heritage farmhouse came back. The developer had backed out. It was going to auction. We bought it. It took 3 more years to make it livable, and 2 more after that to make it what we'd imagined, and there were months in there that tested us. But we'd both grown up in the valley. We knew what long work looked like. Our daughter arrived in the 2nd year, in March, during a late-season snowstorm that closed the highway and meant we drove to the hospital behind a salt truck for half an hour. We named her Margot, after my grandmother. She was born with Isabel's eyes and my stubbornness, which Isabel said was going to be a problem, and I said was a feature. Our son came 2 years after that. We named him Henri, after Isabel's grandfather. He was quieter than his sister, which we were grateful for, and keenly interested in what I was doing in the shop. From the time he was old enough to follow me there, one Tuesday in October, about 6 years after that afternoon at the picnic table, I was replacing a rotting fascia board on the shed when Isabel came out with the kids. She had a thermos. Margot ran straight for the pile of wood chips behind the shed because she had decided this was her territory, and no one had corrected her on it. Henri walked beside his mother with the careful attention of someone who had learned to watch how things worked. Isabel poured a cup and handed it to me without asking how I took it. I looked at her. She shrugged, the way she shrugs when she's done something ordinary that she finds privately amusing. I drank the coffee. The birch at the back of the yard were going orange and gold. Margot had gotten wood chips in her hair. Henri was looking at my hammer with an expression I recognized as intent. Isabel leaned her shoulder against mine the way she does when she doesn't need to say anything. "Do you remember that first day?" she asked. "You sat at this table and drank my coffee and pretended you were just waiting for my dad. I was waiting for your dad." "Joel." I smiled. "I was also not entirely waiting for your dad." She laughed once, and I felt it beside me. I pulled her closer. The kids argued about the wood chips. The birch kept turning, and I thought about the man I'd been 6 years ago. Good at the work, steady at the work, moving through his days without wanting anything too specifically. Because wanting specific things meant they could be taken away. I thought about how I had almost let the best thing in my life pass me by. Not because it was distant, but because it had been right there the whole time, at the next property, at the picnic table, pouring coffee she'd already made too much of. I had been slow, I had been careful, and I had, in the end, been brave enough. Just barely, just enough to say the thing out loud. And Isabel, who was braver than me from the start, had said the true thing back. From that one honest Saturday morning in a garden, everything that mattered had begun.